Around the globe, governments are taking on a role in regulating how personal data is gathered and used. In this video, we'll take a high-level look at the most prominent laws: GDPR, CCPA, and COPPA. It's important for marketing analysts to know about these laws as they regulate how user data can be used. And of course, as a consumer, it's also good to know what your rights are. All three of these regulations affect how much and what type of data an advertiser can use for data-based advertising. Let's begin with GDPR. GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a law that protects data and online privacy in the European Union. GDPR is a very detailed and pretty complex law. At a high level, we can group some of its key requirements in two buckets: European citizen data rights and data protection obligations for companies who collect the data. The law specifies that people have the right to access the personal information received about them, they have the right to correct that information, the right to have all the information that was collected and saved about them erased, and they have the right to data portability. In other words, they have the right to get a file of their personal information and pass it on to another party. As for the data protections obligations, the law specifies how companies must protect the information they receive. It also specifies that companies must alert people within 72 hours if their personal data was leaked, and companies must designate people whose job it will be to protect the data they received. The law also says that companies should limit their data collection and that certain data categories are prohibited, for instance, ethnicity and sexual orientation. And before receiving any data, companies should ask for permission. This is the right to prior consent. GDPR was developed and is managed by the European Union. Any company that works with the personal data of EU residents must comply, no matter where the business is based. In practice, this means that most digital businesses have to comply with this law. The different EU countries each have their own supervisory authorities that monitor compliance. Fines related to GDPR can be substantial, up to 4% of the annual revenue of a company. In October 2020, clothing retailer H&M was issued a $41 million GDPR fine after several hundred employees were found to be illegally under surveillance. The company kept extensive profiles of employees' families, illnesses, and religious beliefs. The Data Protection Authority of Hamburg, Germany, found that this case showed a disregard for GDPR data protection rules. Laws like this and fines of this magnitude have reinforced how seriously the European Union is taking personal data privacy. Next, let's look at the CCPA. In 2019, the Governor of California signed into law the California Consumer Privacy Act. Enforcement of the law started in 2020. The strictest of any consumer privacy laws in the US, this law aims to give residents of California more privacy and protection. This law is not dissimilar from the GDPR. The law wants to give consumers more insight into what data is collected about them and a say in whether or not they want their data collected. There are 5 distinct rights the CCPA gives to consumers: the right to know what information is collected about them, the right to know whether their data is sold and to whom, and the right to opt out of that sale, the right to access the personal information that was collected about them, the right to require a business to delete their personal information, and finally, the right to not be discriminated against for exercising their rights under the Act. The CCPA falls under the responsibility of the California State Attorney General's Office. Any business that collects and controls the personal information of California residents should comply with the CCPA. The California Attorney General and residents of California can initiate lawsuits. Fines under the CCPA can be up to $7,500 for intentional violations and $2,500 for unintentional violations. The law went into effect in January 2020. It's still a bit too early for any high-profile lawsuits under this law. Another important law to be aware of as a marketing analyst is COPPA, or the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. This US law took effect in 2000 and limits the collection and use of personal information of people under the age of 13. COPPA was specifically designed to protect children. It requires that notice be given and parental consent is obtained before any personal information is collected from children. It also requires that companies have a clear and comprehensive privacy policy, and companies that collect data from minors need to keep that data confidential and secure. COPPA is managed by the US Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC. All companies that interact with children under the age of 13 in the US must comply with COPPA. The FTC relies on people to alert them to violations of COPPA, and those complaints can prompt an investigation. Fines related to COPPA can be very substantial, up to $40,000 per violation. Here's one example of a high-profile case that violated COPPA. In 2019, Google was fined $170 million for collecting and saving personal information from children and using it for advertising on YouTube. Needless to say, violations can be costly, not only in terms of the fines, but also in terms of the consumer trust that is lost. This was just a high-level overview of the most prominent laws governments have established to regulate the collection and use of personal data. There may be other local regulations, so depending on the region you work in, it's worth checking which laws are in place. Next, you'll find an overview of how advertising groups have organized to make sure these regulations are understood and implemented across the entire advertising industry.